Okay, so this morning we're continuing and ending our last of our 3 classes through Project Inspire, a wonderful organization, regarding the fundamentals of prayer and the foundations of prayer. And just a quick review, our first class was really about the 3 R's, right? That Hashem wants a relationship with his creations. And one of the ways that we develop this relationship is through talking to Hashem, is through having a relationship through prayer. Also, he wants us to ask from him, request, the second R. He wants us to ask him for our needs and for what we want and for what we're missing. And in the largest and the smallest aspects of our lives, there's never something that is too small or too big to ask for. And the third idea of prayer is the idea of reflect, self-reflection, self-judgment, right? Lahit palel is a reflexive word, that when we stand in prayer before God, or even in terms of our own introspection, when we ask for things, we want to know what the purpose is of our gaining that or acquiring that thing, what we're going to do with it, how it's going to help us in terms of deepening our relationship with ourselves, with others, and of course, with the one who gives us everything that we have, God himself. Okay, secondly, in our second class, we focused on the morning blessings, and we said that the cornerstone of Judaism is gratitude, right? The very beginning of the Torah begins with Adam and Chava and the sin, and basically them showing little gratitude. Adam says, you know, it was this wife that you gave me, God, that caused all the problems. And basically the idea of not being grateful without gratitude, really relationship with God is very, very difficult to have. So what I want to do today is I want to go to a deeper aspect of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, specifically by looking at the Shema prayer, one of the central prayers of the Jewish people. Really, it's our pledge of allegiance, our declaration of faith. And when I talk about Shema and I'm talking about relationship, I'm talking about a deeper kind of relationship that's based on commitment, because that's really what the Shema prayer is about. It's about our commitment to God and God's commitment to us. And of course, commitment, it may be not such a, it's a bit of a dirty word today, right? I mean, people don't like committing. I remember when I was studying in Israel, my Rebbitzin said to us, you want to destroy a good friendship? Get married. That was like sort of what was going on, in the 80s and the 70s. And I guess it's continued to this day. But the idea of commitment in Judaism is integral to developing and deepening this relationship that we want to have and establish with God. And of course, this prayer, the Shema, is one of the central prayers, as I said. It's the Pledge of Allegiance. It's our declaration of faith. And it's funny, my son, we lived in America for a while, and we lived in a small place called Binghamton, New York. And my son must have been about, 8. And he came home from school the first day. He was horrified. He said, I think we said something not Jewish in class today. And we said, what are you talking about? He said, well, we had to put our hand on our heart and we said, I pledge allegiance to the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one God. Anyway, he was just, and we of course started laughing. And, he was going to a Jewish school. It was the smallest Jewish day school in North America. Existed in Binghamton, New York. And he came home and we said, oh, it's okay. That's all right. That's just American patriotism. You don't have to worry about it being a contradiction to, pledging allegiance to God like we do in the Shema. Okay. Now, interestingly, the Shema Yisrael in the Torah, the word Shema actually is written with an enlarged ayin. And Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, the Daled at the end of the phrase is written enlarged as well, with a large Daled. And of course, the question is why? There are nothing is haphazard when it comes to the Torah. And the letters Ayin and Dalet actually spell the word aid. And aid is a witness. So the idea is that when we say the Shema Yisrael, when we say those words at the beginning, we are basically testifying as Jews to the concept of God's oneness, which was a very revolutionary idea, by the way, when it came into the world. Okay, there's so many times that we say the Shema. First of all, from a halachic viewpoint, we're supposed to say the Shema twice a day, in the morning when we wake up and in the evening when we go to sleep. There's other times that we say the Shema. I don't know if you know this, but for example, the night before a newborn baby boy is about to have his bris, the night before the bris, there's a custom to bring over all the little kids from the neighborhood and give them treats and candy. And they say Shema Yisrael around the baby's crib as a protection for his operation in the morning. Okay, because nighttime is always associated with danger, with evil even. And so that's one of the reasons also that we say the Shema before we go to bed at night. We also say it on Yom Kippur at the end of Ne'ilah, right? Right before Yom Kippur ends, we shout it out very loud. And it's said again, we say it before we die. I have to tell you, just recently we watched this movie from 1984 with Jacqueline Bisset called Forbidden. It was a movie about the Holocaust. And it was really a story about a very, very assimilated German Jew who could not accept the fact that the Nazis were doing what they were doing. It was just beyond his comprehension, to the point that even when he was supposed to be in hiding, he couldn't help himself and went out to his old neighborhood and walked around as if he was a free man. Of course, that episode ended in some other Jew who was actually being, the Nazis were allowing him to stay alive if he would catch 10 Jews a month. So he actually met this other Jew and who was trying to get him to admit that he was really a Jew. Anyway, he ends up running away from him. But the point is he was completely assimilated. At another point in the movie, they allow in this other Jew to hide with them. And this Jew starts talking to him and says, "So you never had a bar mitzvah probably?" He said, "No." He said, "Did you ever even go to synagogue in your life?" And he says, "Well, maybe once." And as I said, his father was an illustrious German judge, very much a part of German society. Anyway, this man who's hiding with them begins to teach him the Shema Yisrael, which he's never heard before. And he's saying it to him, teaching it to him while they're in hiding, and he's repeating it after him. Anyway, at the end of the movie, when the Russians are bombing Berlin and the war is basically over, the Russians find this man with the woman who he's hiding with, who's a non-Jewish woman. True story, they end up getting married. And she's yelling at the Russian soldier going, "He's not a German, he's a Jew, he's a Jew, he's a Jew." And of course, the Russian soldier doesn't believe him and doesn't hear him and doesn't understand what she's saying. And he's, butting him with his rifle and he's about to kill him. And then all of a sudden he cries out what he learned from this Jewish guy who was hiding with him. "Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad." And this Russian soldier says to him, "Reb Yid, Shalom Aleichem." He turns out to be a Russian Jewish soldier. So this was the end of the movie, and it was so poignant to see how a mitzvah like Shema could literally save a person's life. And there are so many countless stories like that, where either, a mitzvah, specifically the Shema, could save a person's life, or the opposite, right? How many Jews went to their death with the words of the Shema Yisrael on their lips? As a matter of fact, I heard once that a Nazi who worked in the concentration camps horrifically said that the way that he knew that every Jew was gassed successfully And dead was when he heard the last Shema Yisrael emanating from the chamber. So this is a very powerful prayer. It's a prayer that if we say nothing else, right? It's a prayer that we should try to incorporate into our day, into our morning, into our evening. Of course, morning is the time when you are most fresh. Evening is the time, again, when you're also more open, right? You take it with you into your nighttime. And it's a very powerful way to go through your day with the Shema morning and night. Okay, we don't want to, Reb Noach Weinberg, who began Eshet Torah, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, said something very powerful. He said, know what you're going to die for and then live for it. Whatever you would give up your life for, that's what you should be living for. And we know that so many Jews were willing to give up their lives with the Shema on their lips, professing that there's only one God in the world, and not turn their back on their Jewish beliefs. And Rebbetzin Heller once said, they weren't necessarily Torah scholars. They weren't necessarily people who, came from illustrious families, that even the most simplest Jew throughout history was willing to give up their lives for this truth. And the bitter truth is sometimes it's actually easier to die for something than it is to live for it. Dying is a one-time act. Living for God is a constant practice, discipline. It demands certain things, certain sacrifices sometimes, not giving up our lives, but other kinds of sacrifices, and so living for God is often, people say, even harder than dying for God. So where did this expression come from? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So first of all, the idea of monotheism. Let's talk about that for a minute. Were there monotheists before Avraham? Well, of course there were, right? Adam and Eve were created by God. God was their parent. It was very clear to them that there is one God. However, not to give an in-depth history lesson, what happened is basically from the time of Adam and Chava until Noah, which was 10 generations, the concept of one God was completely lost. The Rambam, Maimonides, explains that people had trouble with an invisible God. And so they basically rationalized or deduced, you know what? Instead of worshiping God, we can worship God's servants. We'll worship the sun and the moon and the stars. We'll worship nature. And we'll make many, many gods. And that's what would eventually happen until the time of Noah. We know that Noah and his family still had this tradition of one God. Okay? Noah's son, he had 3 sons. One of his sons' names was Shem. Shem is where the Jewish people come from the word Semites, anti-Semites, literally comes from anti-Shem, right? And Shem and Aver, another person, I'm not sure what his source is, they literally had a yeshiva in those 10 generations between Noah and Avraham that was learning and studying whatever they knew at the time. Maybe they had access to the Torah before it was given. They were studying about the one God, but it was very cloistered. It was an ivory tower. There was no interest in teaching it to the world. Now, 10 generations from Noah, we have Avraham. Now, a lot of people think of Avraham as the first Jew, but he wasn't a Jew. There was no such thing as Jews until after Mount Sinai, until after we got the Torah. Who Avraham was he was called a Hebrew, right? We know we're called Hebrews. Avraham ha-Ivri. Now, where did we get that word from? The word Ivri, Hebrew, actually means to cross over. And what we're told about Avraham is Avraham was a man who crossed over to the other side, meaning the entire world believed in idol worship. believed in, offering all kinds of things up to these gods. And Avraham had developed a belief in God from the age of 3 until he was about 40, which he continuously delved into. And he was standing, so to speak, on one side of the world with his understanding of monotheism against all of the idol worshipers, including his own father. There's an interesting medrash that tells about how Avram's father owned the biggest idol worship shop in town and, was very successful. He had he was very successful, and how Avraham as a young child breaks all of the idols in his father's shop and places the axe in one idol that he leaves intact, the largest idol. And when his father comes into the shop and says, "What happened here?" Avram says to him, "Well, don't you see what happened? This idol broke all the other ones. They had a war and he was the winner." And of course, his father says, "What are you talking about? This idol doesn't move, it doesn't talk, it can't do that." And Avraham explains to him, "Exactly, Dad. Like, don't you get it? I know you're making a lot of money out of this, but this is a bunch of baloney." So this was Avraham HaIvri. He was the first Hebrew, and he not only believed in monotheism, as did Noach, as did Adam and Chava, as did Shem and Aver. He was going to teach it to the world. He was the first Kiruv rabbi. And he and Sarah write Lech Lecha. They leave their home and they start to travel. And they have this open tent, and they're inviting everybody in to learn about the one God, right? There's a beautiful story too about how Avraham would feed them and lodge them and give them to drink and take care of their every need, anybody who came to him in the desert. And when they were leaving, they'd say, "How much do we owe you?" And he'd say, "Well, you don't owe me anything. Who you owe is God himself, because I'm just a conduit for God's blessings, and I'm just sharing them with you." And the way Avram would handle these guests is if they would say, "Well, yeah, I don't believe in God." And he'd say, "Okay, if you don't want to thank God, then you owe me, $1,500 for your week here at my hotel." So if they didn't want to say thank you to God, he'd make them pay down, down to everything. Okay. All right. So what do we say? Let's look at the prayer itself. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. It means, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So one of the famous commentators, Rashi, says that a central idea here is that, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That now he's our God, but one day he will be the God of all of mankind. Okay. Now, where do we hear about this expression? This is something I learned once on a plane ride to Israel. I was sitting next to an older man. He was probably in his 70s. I never forgot him because he actually ended up singing at our wedding. He was a chazan as well and a songwriter. But this was one of the first ideas I learned about Judaism, was from him on my way to Israel as a young 18-year-old. And he told me, "Do you know where this comes from? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad." He said it comes from, the Medrash tells us, when Jacob was on his deathbed. He had all of his children gathered around him. If you remember the scene, if you know it in the Torah, this is when he's blessing his sons before he dies. And he's a little bit nervous. He's a little bit nervous about whether or not they're going to carry on this tradition of monotheism, whether they're going to be able to pass it forward. Avraham had a Yishmael, Isaac had an Esav, and he was worried that maybe there were some of his own children that were flawed in some way, that would not be able to pass this important message to the world and all that it means and contains, pass it forward. So they felt his worry, and this is what they said to him: "Shema Yisrael, listen, our father." Of course, Jacob had two names, right? His higher name was Yisrael. We're called the Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Okay? So they answered him. They said to him, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel. Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. We've got it. Hashem is our God, and God is one. And we're told, the Midrash tells us that when Yaakov heard that, he answered back, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. Right? The next line in the Shema, which is blessed is God's name forever and ever, and his kingdom forever and ever. So this is just one of the sources for how to read the Shema and understand. So what about the word Shema? I want to talk to you a little bit about the word Shema. What do we mean when we say hear? And I'm going to quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who talks about the spirituality of listening. He says, the word Shema means to hear, to listen, to pay attention, to understand, to internalize. It can mean all of these things in English, he says, in Hebrew. To respond, to obey. It appears no less than 92 times in the book of Devarim. In the last month of Moses' life, he tells the people, Shema, listen, heed, pay attention, hear what I'm saying, hear what God is saying, listen to what he wants from us. And he says, and he explains that Judaism is a religion of listening. And this is one of its most original contributions to civilization. In contrast, he says, this idea that knowing is seeing is believing, remains the dominant metaphor in the West even today. But Judaism offered a radical alternative. It is faith in a God we cannot see, a God who cannot be turned into idolatry. As Moses tells the people after they have this revelation with God, you heard the sound of words, but you saw no image. There was only a voice. God communicates in sounds, not sights. He speaks, he commands, he calls. That is why the supreme religious act is Shema. When God speaks, we listen. When he commands, we try to obey. And he goes on to explain that active listening is so important for a relationship, not only between people, but between us and Hashem and God. Because when a person listens, it shows that they care. It shows respect. It shows an interest to the point where we're saying what's important to you is important to me, even if I don't understand it. So there's the word Shema. Pay attention. Understand. And the next word, Yisrael. Yisrael is talking to the Jewish people. Beautiful idea. In the word Yisrael, we have all of the initials of the Avot and Imahot, of our forefathers and our foremothers. The word Yisrael contains a Yud, which is for Yaakov and Yitzchak, Jacob and Isaac, a Sin for Sarah, a Resh for Rivka and Rachel, an Aleph for Avraham, and a Lamed for Leah. So in the name of Israel, we're called the children of Israel. We have the bedrock, the foundation stone of the great people that began this message into the world of the one God, the God who is God of all of mankind, who began the world with Adam and Chava, from which every human being springs from. And therefore the interdependence of all of us together as a people. The Jewish people may be called the oldest child, but all of the people in the world are God's children. We may be called the firstborn, meaning we have, parents always have great expectations of the firstborn, right? The firstborn, on the one hand, gets all the goodies, but they also get the biggest punishments when they go astray, because the understanding is that you're supposed to be the example, right? You're the one that everyone's going to copy. So this idea, though, that God belongs to everybody. Now, there's 72 different names of Hashem, by the way. In the Jewish tradition, we have 72 names of Hashem, which express obviously different aspects of Hashem. In this bracha, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we have two names of Hashem. One is the one that, well, they're both very familiar to you, I'm sure. Hashem with the Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. And Elokeinu, which comes from the word Elohim, Elohim, right? We don't, right? Now, the Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey is a name that we don't pronounce the way it's written. We just say Hashem or Adoshem, right? When you're praying, you use the real word. And it stands for He was, He is, and He will always be. Haya, Hoveh, V'yihiyeh. I always like to tell this story that I was once teaching that to some Russians when we were living in New York. And one of my Russian students gasped. And I said, what? And she said, that's what they taught us to think of every time we say the name Lenin. We were supposed to think he was, he is, and he will always be. And it just brought home to me, wow, how these dictators of the world really were trying to replace God, right? And that's what, you know, Hitler, Yamach Shemo, and all of these people, Paro, from the beginning of time. It's the reason I have to get rid of the Jews is because the Jews, as Hitler said, represent God consciousness in the world. And if I can get rid of the Jews, I can get rid of God consciousness and I can be God, right? The true God consciousness. So that's one explanation for anti-Semitism. Okay, but we have two names here, Hashem, Elokeinu. Elokeinu also represents a power, tremendous power, the powerful aspect of God. But another thing, Hashem, the name Hashem, always connotes compassion. The compassionate and merciful side of God. And Elohim always corresponds to God's din, his judgment, his justice. God as king, you know, there's laws, there's rules, you do them, then it will be good for you. You don't do them, then it's off with your head. Strict judgment. Now it's very interesting. If you look into the Torah, you will see that the only name that is used for God until man is created is the name Elohim, the God of strict judgment. Because when it comes to animals and plants and all the things that were created before man, God doesn't need to have compassion. However, as soon as the first human being is created after Adam and Chava come onto the scene, this is the first place where it says, Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et ha'adam. And Hashem, God, Hashem Elokim, formed man from the dust of the earth. Because now with man in the center of the stage, God will need to combine both his compassion and his judgment and his justice to be able to keep man alive. Because if he only uses strict justice when it comes to human beings, we wouldn't survive for a day, maybe not even for an hour. right? We were endowed with free will, with free choice, unlike any other creation. And therefore, God gives us the ability to do what we want to do, to make our own choices. If we want to shoot ourselves in the foot, we can do that, right? If we want to completely ignore what is good for us, we'll do that because we'd rather take the easy road, maybe. The point is now God will need to mix mercy together with judgment to be able to allow us the space to say, I'm sorry, to be forgiven, to try again, because God knows the nature of his creation, that, we will make mistakes, that we will do things that are counterproductive, not only for ourselves, but to God's world. And God allows us to have that space by giving us the two names, Hashem Elohim, which we have in that Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem is our God. Hashem Echad. Hashem is one. Now, what do we mean when we say that Hashem is one? What do we mean by that? And why do we cover our eyes when we're saying it? Right? If you're right-handed, you take your right hand and you cover your eyes and you say these words. Why do we do that? And how are the two connected? Okay, so the first idea about the oneness of God, the best way that it's explained is that the oneness of God is like a ray of light, a single ray of light that's seen through a prism. And of course, when light goes through a prism, it creates many, many colors. And instead of getting confused and thinking that all those colors are different gods, if you will, right? The recognition that they're all coming from the same light, from that same one source of light, is this concept of monotheism. God has 72 names. He reveals himself in many different ways. He has different aspects to him. He's not just one character type, if you will. And even with all we know about God, God is unknowable in Jewish terms. He's beyond anything we can comprehend. But manifestations of God are given to us in order for us to know who God is to some degree. Okay. Now, we cover our eyes when we say Shema because it's very hard to believe in one God with your eyes. The nature of the world is a world of duality. The Torah itself begins with the letter Bet, Bereshit, to allude to this idea of a world of duality, right? We have darkness and light. We have sadness and joy. We have good and bad. We have men and female. There's a lot of duality in the world. And so a person can get very confused. Other religions create God and an evil force against God because of this idea of duality. Judaism has no such thing. We cover our eyes because the world around us confuses us with this duality. And so when we're saying God is one, we don't want to use our physical eyes. We have to go deeper. We have to go deeper than that. Of course, the question, why is it that righteous people suffer, right? This is part of the duality of life. Why do the righteous suffer? And of course, this is a question that goes back thousands of years. It was a question that Moshe himself asked of God. And there in the Torah, God explains to Moshe, in this world, you will only see my back. In other words, you will never really understand the answer to that question in this world. I can't even tell it to you in this world. And in the next world, you'll, so to speak, be able to see my face. Because in this world, you can't see my face and live, right? As physical human beings, it's too powerful. So you'll only see my back. Now there was I don't you know, there was a famous book that came out by a conservative rabbi. I think he called himself a Kushner. I'm sure you've heard of it. It was a very popular book asking this question. He wrote it in response to his own child, I think, who had died from a terrible disease. And unfortunately, his answer to that question was extremely heretical in Jewish terms. Because what he basically said is that God only does good, and God cannot do anything but what we would call good. And therefore, there's some kind of evil power in the world that God himself cannot control. Now, to say that God can't control something is completely heretical. To say that God is powerful, but not as powerful as you imagine, right? So this is not a Jewish idea. The Jewish idea is that the oneness of God is that everything is in his power. And if he allows bad and negative and evil to take place in this world, it's only because that's what keeps our free will, our ability to choose, intact, right? If we lived in a world where every time you did something good, you know, money fell out of the sky or your bank account went up, right? Without even putting any money in it. And every time you did something bad, you know, you spoke negatively about your friend, your tongue fell out or you got a blister on it, right? There wouldn't be a lot of room for error or free will. We would just be good robots, as Rav Noach Weinberg used to say. You'd be a good robot. You know, don't want to do that. I know what happens when I put my hand in the fire. So we cover our eyes when we're saying that God is one, because it can be very confusing. Now, I'll share with you one of my favorite stories about this idea. So there was a famous rabbi, hold on one second, Rabbi Yehoshua, who lived in Talmudic times. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, and he had this question: why do the righteous suffer? And one day he was outside and he actually met Eliyahu Hanavi. Now you all know who Eliyahu Hanavi is. He's the one who comes in the door on Pesach night and drinks the wine. You know, your father probably shook the table like mine did when he came in to say, look, he's drinking, right? And you wondered how he didn't get really drunk going to every Jewish home all over the world, right? But anyway, Eliyahu Hanavi was a real person, and this Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi meets him one day. And he asks him this question. He says, I want to know why good people suffer. And Eliyahu Hanavi says, oh, you want to know that? And he says, well, listen, I'm going to allow you to travel with me for some time so that you can be enlightened about this question. On one condition, however, you are not allowed to ask me any questions along our journey about what I do and what transpires. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi agrees, and they travel together and they come to this broken down cabin, and they're greeted by this lovely couple, this older man and his wife, who invite them into their broken down place. They've got one cow that's very thin, but that they get their milk from, and it keeps them alive. And they offer Eliyahu Hanavi and Rabbi Yehoshua everything that they have, including their own bed. Meanwhile, the next morning when they get up and they're davening shacharis and getting ready to leave, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi overhears Eliyahu praying to God, saying, their cow should die. God, please let their cow die. And of course, Rabbi Yehoshua is thinking, what? After all they've done for us, this is what you pray for? I don't get it. And he starts to ask Eliyahu Hanavi, and Eliyahu says, remember, you promised, you're not allowed to ask any questions. Anyway, they go on to the next place and they come to the home of an extremely wealthy man. And they knock on the door and nobody answers, and they knock again and they knock again. And finally, one of the servants comes to the door and says, there's a bunch of beggars at the door. And this wealthy man says, what do they want? You know, put them outside. They can sleep on the stone bench in the backyard. And he doesn't offer them anything to eat. And he's in an extremely grumpy mood, even more than usual, because one of the walls of his house has collapsed. Okay, so they leave that place. The next morning, they're davening, they're praying to God. And Rabbi Yoshua overhears Eliyahu saying that that wall of his house that collapsed should miraculously be restored. And of course, Rabbi Yoshua is thinking, what? Why would you daven like that? I mean, this guy was rotten to the core. Anyway, Eliyahu says, no questions, you promised. They continue on. They come to a beautiful, beautiful shul. And they go into the shul, and the people there are very, very wealthy, but nobody invites them home. And the few people that see them in shuls, they say, here's some bread, some water, a little salt. You can sleep in the synagogue. So they sleep on this hard bench in the synagogue. The next morning, Eliyahu prays, and he says, may it be your will, God, that all of these people become leaders and important people. And of course, Rabbi Yoshua is very perplexed, but he's not allowed to ask, not allowed to say anything. They go on to the next city. People are not so wealthy, very poor. Not only before they even get there, the people come out to greet them and welcome them. They give them the best that they have of their food and their drink. They sit with them and keep them company and open up their homes to them. And when they're about to leave there the next morning, Eliyahu prays that Hashem should grant them only one leader. Okay, their journeys are over and they're beginning to depart from one another. And finally, you know, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi can't take it anymore. He says, I don't understand. Please, please show me a little bit about God's hidden ways, about why it is that the righteous suffer. So Eliyahu Hanavi begins to explain to him. He says, do you remember that first couple where I prayed for the cow to die? He said, well, there was a decree in heaven that the wife should die. And I asked God, don't take the wife. Please take the cow instead. In the second place we went with that horrible wealthy guy who didn't give us anything to eat, who made us sleep outside. He said he didn't realize it, but behind that collapsed wall, there was a treasure that had been hidden there from the former people that was full of a large treasure of gold. And because the wall was rebuilt miraculously like that, he'll never find it. He'll never find it. He said, in the third place I went in the shul where they didn't give us a thing, I prayed that they would all become leaders, because where there's arrogant people who all become leaders, they will have no blessing and no peace, because they will be constantly quarreling and being contentious with each other. But in the last place where I prayed that there should only be one leader, that the best man should lead, there they'll have blessing and peace and happiness. And anyway, that story, even though it was a long one, I wanted to share it with you because it helps us all to recognize the idea that we cover our eyes when we say the Shema, because we don't really understand the ways of God and the ways of the world. You know, it says about the tree in the Garden of Eden that God told Adam and Eve not to eat from. It says it was desirous, it was good, it was beautiful. But of course, for them, it spelled death and destruction to the whole world, right? We call something bitter medicine. You know, we take the medicine, it's going to make us well, but it's bitter to drink. So we don't always know what's good and what's bad. And that's the point of the idea of God being one, that we recognize that God knows what's good and what's always good, even if it doesn't feel good. Okay, we've got a little bit more time, so let's say a little bit more about this prayer. So we say, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. You, God, are the God of compassion, Hashem Elokeinu. You're our God, using the word Elohim. You're the God of justice. And then we say Hashem again, as if to say that we want God to lead with his compassionate self. Echad. Let's talk about that word Echad. So interestingly, I said at the beginning of the class that the Daled is written larger in the word Echad. So one of the reasons is that the Daled also looks very similar to another letter in the Hebrew alphabet, the letter Resh, right? You could confuse the two. So the whoever wrote whatever, the Torah was written with an extra large Daled, so people shouldn't think instead of saying Echad, it says Acher, meaning there's another God. The word Acher means another God. We also have the same idea with the word Shema. Why does it say ayin? Because God forbid the Jewish people in our thousands of years of exile should write the letter Aleph instead of ayin, because again, they're both silent letters. Because Shema with an Aleph means maybe or perhaps there's one God. So they wanted to make no mistake that in this Pledge of Allegiance, it would be clear for all times that the ayin and the dalet, again, which means testifying, being a witness to the concept of one God, which is our mission and our purpose in this world, right? We get our mission, and our mission statement is to spread this idea in the world that God is one. And he's our God now, but he's the God of everyone. Now, the word Elokeinu also means he's a personal God who loves you. He wants a relationship with you. When we say the word Echad, we're actually supposed to draw out the second syllable and emphasize the final consonant. So if you go into a shul where the people are very religious, you'll hear them saying Echad, and they really prolong it and they really emphasize it. Now, the Dalet at the end of Echad represents the four directions of the world, and it's telling us that Hashem is the master of the four directions. Also, the Aleph represents the oneness of God, the first letter of the alphabet. The Chet is the number 8, and we say that there are 7 heavens. You know that secular expression, I'm in 7th heaven? Well, it comes from the Jews. We believe there's 7 heavens, and that God is up on top of the 7th heaven. So that's the number 8. And of course, Dalet is the 4 directions of the world. Now, while you're saying the word Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, you're actually supposed to be concentrating on this concept called Ol Malchus Shamayim, which means accepting the yoke of heaven, accepting the obligation, the responsibility to spread this teaching and this practice to the world. And what is a yoke? Well, we know about the word yoke when it comes to to animals. Why do they put a yoke on an animal? Because the yoke gives the animal direction, right? It's there, you know, like when they put blinders on a dog because they don't want them to go other ways. A yoke was always meant to direct the animal. So, and it actually allows it to pull a heavy load. If the rope was tied around its neck, it would choke the animal. So it's put on their back. And I had a teacher once who said, you know, everybody in this world wants a yoke. Everybody wants to feel that they have a purpose and a reason and a cause. One of the higher levels of pleasure, Rav Noach Weinberg spoke about, and Abraham Maslow even speaks about as a secular psychologist, is to have higher level pleasures of having a cause or a purpose or something you'd give up your life for, and living with meaning. And everybody wants this. And I had a Rebbitzin who used to say, you know, in the 60s, the Jewish kids, They wanted a yoke. So what did they do? They put a backpack on their back. They schlepped a heavy backpack. They left their homes of luxury and wealth, and they schlepped their yoke through Europe, saying, you know, look at me, I'm important. I've got my yoke. I've got my sleeping bag. I've got my provisions. And, you know, I'm becoming somebody. Because when you're carrying a yoke, when you have a responsibility, when you feel that you've got a load to carry, it gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a sense of self. Okay, there's so much to say about this prayer. We could do like a 10-week series on it. We haven't even done the Shema Yisrael, the first line of it. But I want to tell you another beautiful story that I love, which is a story about a rabbi named Rabbi Eliezer Silver, who was very involved in efforts to save Jews during the war, during World War II. And the story goes that at the end of the war, he went to Europe. He was an American rabbi, and he went to all the different convents and all the places where he knew that throughout the war, they had, so to speak, saved Jewish children physically, but spiritually, of course, they had them baptized. They were very excited about being able to get Jewish children to, you know, whose parents were wherever they were, if they had survived the war, were no longer there. And now they could make these Jewish souls, they could save them from damnation and give them a Catholic baptism. Anyway, this rabbi knew that there were a lot of Jewish kids in these monasteries. And he took a trip from one to the other. He'd go to the, you know, main priest or nun and say, I would like to see if you have any Jewish children here. And of course, they would say, well, no, we don't have any Jewish children here. There aren't any Jewish children in our keep. If we had them, we'd, you know, try to find their parents. We wouldn't do such a thing. So Rabbi Silver insisted. He said, okay, I'm sure you're telling the truth, but do you mind if I come in and see the children? And he would arrange that he would go around bedtime. And he'd asked to be taken in. I always, I picture like Madeline, you know, like 10 girls and 10 beds, whatever, like a room full of beds, right? With all these little children in them. And Rabbi Silver would come to the front of the room. And, you know, of course, the nuns would be beside him saying, we don't have any Jewish children here. And Rabbi Silver would say, okay, just let me, you know, let me check. And he would yell out from the front of the room, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And he would watch. And any child whose lips moved to say, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, he would walk around and say, that's a Jewish child, there's a Jewish child, that's a Jewish child. And he would walk out of one monastery after the other, rescuing these Jewish neshamas, these Jewish souls, through the prayer Shema Yisrael. So if there was anything that they remembered after being torn away from their parents, it was this nighttime prayer that they said in their beds, that their parents taught them from the time they were able to speak. So the Shema Yisrael saves lives. Another story, an Israeli who actually went to the shul here, Shari Shemayim, he told a story about how he fought in the Yom Kippur War. And in his unit was a very anti-religious guy who was an atheist. He didn't believe in God. He was extremely anti-religious. And he said they were engaged in a really tough battle. And there was a large explosion that took place next to them. And he couldn't believe his eyes, but this Chiloni, as we call in Hebrew, this non-believing Jew, anti-religious Jew, yells out at the top of his voice, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And he looks at him in total shock and he says, why did you do that? Why did you say that? And this guy answered, he said, I don't know. I have no idea where it came from. There's a famous rabbi, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who says that it's easier to make a God the king over the whole world than to make him king over yourself, right? He can be king over the world, but don't tell me what to do, okay? Don't tell me what to do. You could be king over the world in general, in abstract, theoretical, but don't get too involved in my life, right? And that is the challenge, and that is the cognitive dissonance that we all live. How much do we let God in? How much do we allow him to, structure our lives, to put a yoke on us and say, go this way, don't go that way, right? And this is part of the relationship, the commitment that we as Jews have always shown, and it's been the secret to our survival. We know that. We know that it's been the secret to our survival, this commitment. The words of the Shema, there's 248 words in the Shema prayer, and they correspond to the 248 positive mitzvot, right? We have 248 positive mitzvot, 365 negative mitzvot, meaning don't do's. We have 248 do's, do this, do that. And the positive mitzvot always represent love, right? They're positive, meaning they're outward. They're as opposed to the negative mitzvot, which are based on fear or awe or respect, right? And those ask us to restrain ourselves, to pull back, to say no. And we need both. But the Shema prayer is primarily a prayer of love. We're going to end now. We can't really get into this unless the Project Inspire wants to continue this series. If you want them to do so, you can let Miriam Leibowitz know. But really, the idea of love and loving God, when you really love somebody, you want to do what makes them happy. You don't want to do anything that would create some kind of discord in the relationship, a disappointment. When you truly respect and care and love, and of course the love is based on, again, gratitude, recognizing all the blessings in your life. The Rambam says the love is based on looking around the world and gaining knowledge and appreciation of God through all of the incredible nature and the food and the flowers and the smells and the incredible blessings that surround us. And of course, love is fostered by giving. So it's not only that God gives to us, but Judaism tells us that we can actually give to God. And that is incredibly empowering, because we know God doesn't need anything. God is perfect. God lacks nothing. And yet Judaism is set up in such a way where God is saying, I left the world unfinished, and I need you to help me complete it. And God tells us, I love you so much, I need you to love me in the same way back. And that's what the Shema prayer is about. And of course, there are so many reasons for us to be able to love God if we do the work of recognizing our blessings, being grateful, asking from God, and seeing ourselves getting some of those things. And okay, we're going to end here. Thank you so much for listening. And if you can incorporate saying just the first line of the Shema in the morning when you wake up, at night before you go to sleep, and think about some of the things that we've spoken about, that is huge. That brings more light into the world. It brings mankind to a greater clarity about the concept of the oneness of God, who is God of all of mankind. Okay, thank you.